So these are the notes on the 5 different ways evolution can be caused. They can be caused through mutation, selection, non-random mating, genetic drift, and gene flow. As we go over these topics, you will recognize them as the opposite of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. The presence of any one of these scenarios can lead to evolution in a population. All 5 of these need to be absent for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, i.e. no evolution to occur. But if just one of them happens in your population, there will be some form of evolution, i.e. changes in the populations and the gene frequency in the population over time. So just having gene flow and no other changes elsewhere will still lead to evolution. Just having genetic drift and no changes elsewhere will still lead to evolution. That's what I mean. Any one of these being affected can lead to evolution. So let's go over them. So we've already covered mutation and natural selection in the prior notes. So I'm not going to go over those in depth, but just to remind you, mutation is changes in your DNA and the variation that's also promoted through sexual selection in some populations. But if you have a group that has a new mutation suddenly show up and is somehow sustained in the population, you're going to end up with some form of evolution over time. Natural selection we kind of covered on the last notes in that we went over one form of natural selection called selection patterns. We also talked about kind of simple versions of natural selection when you're just following one gene and looking how it may change over time to see if there is evolution, especially when there is a drive towards one type of trait or one type of scenario in terms of who has the best fitness. But today we're going to go over some complicated scenarios for natural selection. But at the end of the day, natural selection is all about fitness and traits that allow you to have a better adaptation to the area you're in that will give you an advantage to have more babies. And that can be through either survival or some reproductive advantage. Okay? So, anyways, one of the complicated scenarios is frequency-dependent selection. Okay? So it is the fact that your adaptation, a trait, its ability to be an adaptation, meaning a positive trait to have, may vary based on how frequent that trait is in the population. That's a little confusing, so we'll go over some scenarios of what that means. But if you recall, an adaptation is not always an adaptation. Adaptation just means that you have a trait that gives you an advantage in the area. But for example, a white bunny is going to have an adaptation or well adapted to a snowy area. But that white bunny probably going to die or more likely to die and have issues if they're in like brown dirt. Okay? This is why a lot of animals actually have the ability to change their fur color if they're in an area that has really different climates. They can change their fur color in different seasons. And those are the organisms that are best adapted to the environment they're in. Okay, so an example of frequency-dependent selection where that adaptation isn't going to always be an advantage is positive versus negative scenarios. So a positive scenario actually is a good version where if the trait is very frequent, you're actually more likely to be protected. So positive means more frequent, higher advantage, okay? A classic example of this is a warning pattern on an insect becomes more effective the more insects have it to teach predators to go, oh, if that bug is red or bright blue, I better not eat it because it's going to taste bad or it's going to hurt me. And the more organisms that take on that trait that are dangerous, the more predators learn to go, oh, that's a color or a pattern that I want to avoid. Okay? Another type of frequency-dependent selection is negative selection. Okay? So in this case, negative frequent dependent selection is sort of the opposite. So I'll just write that down. So in this case, this is an example of if a huge group of organisms all have different characteristics that a virus or bacteria likes. Okay? The virus or bacteria are going to evolve to take on the traits that will allow them to attack the majority of the organism that they're going to attack. So the more common this trait is, the more likely the virus or bacteria will attack it or will learn to help avoid and survive, better able to survive it. So in this case, high frequent dependent traits are actually less of an advantage or going to be more dangerous. And that will create scenarios where the organism will flip-flop a lot between the traits. Okay? So think of it sort of like directional selection, but it's moving back and forth. So in this case, right, you might have a scenario before where everyone's like that. They're more at the extreme end, one's extreme end, but as this becomes less of an advantage, it will shift the other way so that in the next case over here, later, it will shift the other way because the traits that are more rare become more advantageous, so that they end up shifting again to the opposite way. But now because this is more frequent, this now becomes dangerous, bad, and then even later you're going to shift again back to the opposite way where this trait, the old trait again, is advantageous. And you're going to just shift back and forth. However, for positive natural selection, let's say you're using, again, directional selection. In this case, let's say more of the population is kind of coming up over on the one side, and over time, more and more of that population will drive towards the most common trait. The way I like to think of this is positive selection is where blending in protects you. So blending in has a protective value, so the more people that are that way, the better off you are. While negative is going to occur when there's high competition, so you're competing against others in your group. But it'll only occur with a predator, generally speaking, or a parasite, generally speaking, that'll shift back and forth to whatever trait is more common. So this is obviously not going to happen with giraffes where all the food is very tall. You can't suddenly go, oh, everyone else is tall, so let's become short, because then there's no food. But it is going to be very, very common when you're talking about predators that are adapted to go with the most common trait, or parasites that are better off attacking the most common trait. Okay? So, anyways, so there's two ways that you can maintain more than one trait in a population through natural selection. Okay? So, generally speaking, if a trait is a disadvantage, even if it may be present in the population, it'll be present in very low numbers. But times where a potentially harmful trait may become more present in a population may occur through one of two scenarios. Negative frequency selection, where a trait that may be a disadvantage may become an advantage depending on how common it is, right? So in this case here, if you look at this scenario, the population, right? In this population, the characteristic that is least represented becomes the most represented by the end, and vice versa. If the other, or not vice versa, and if the other trait that's there, that is sometimes a disadvantage, like in this right-sided scenario, is less represented, then it will become an advantage in later situations. So negative frequency dependent selection will make a trait that may seem harmful in one type of scenario become advantageous later. Another example is what we call balanced polymorphism. So if there's a really harmful trait, but you see it showing up quite frequently in a population, there's often a reason why. And usually it's because the heterozygote trait, the trait where some people have like a very mild form of the disease, actually is protective in the population somehow. So a very famous example of balanced polymorphism where there are two types of the gene, two alleles for the gene that are somehow maintained in the population. Generally speaking, it's done through what's called heterozygous advantage, where the blended trait, so this is a classic example of either incomplete dominance or codominance. But if you have a trait that's incomplete or has codominance, where the heterozygous trait ends up being different than those with the homozygous genotype, then you may see scenarios where even if a disease is very deadly, it's going to show up in high amounts in the population because the heterozygous trait becomes very helpful. A very classic example is sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia results in these cells that are sickle-shaped, very curved, that are very bad for transmitting oxygen around your body. People with heterozygous advantage end up sometimes making bad red blood cells and a mix of good red blood cells. Why is this an advantage? Well, we're talking about malaria. So in malaria, what happens is the parasite inside a mosquito, it's a protozoa, when it gets into your bloodstream, it actually infects your red blood cell and populate in your red blood cells. But for whatever reason, they really suck at populating inside sickle cells. So a trait that is often negative, very negative in this case, sickle cell anemia, becomes an advantage because even though sickle cell is generally lethal because it makes it really hard for your body to carry oxygen, and honestly, you don't have to write this down, okay? It's just to make sure that the info is clear. But in this case, in areas where there's a lot of malaria, you're going to see a lot of people who happen to carry at least one copy of the sickle cell anemia gene because, especially, and this is very unusual for lethal diseases, because there's an advantage to it. Because these people, for whatever reason, slow down the malaria disease if they get malaria. When that parasite enters their body, it has a much harder time destroying or moving through the bloodstream and making lots of babies. Okay? So generally speaking, if you look at the frequency of where sickle cell anemia is found around the world, you're also going to find a higher frequency of malaria found in those areas. There's also related diseases that are very similar to sickle cell anemia, like other anemia diseases, like thalassemia, that are actually more frequent in tropical areas with high amounts of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. So I know thalassemia is much more common in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia has a lot of malaria through the mosquitoes. Okay? So for whatever reason, when red blood cells have a difficult time carrying oxygen, they also have a harder time populating malaria, which means that having a little bit of the disease but not enough to be really sick, like super sick, is an advantage because you're going to have some resistance to dying from a really common disease, infectious disease. Okay? All right, so let's go into the other three scenarios that can cause evolution: gene flow, non-random mating, also known as sexual selection, and genetic drift. So gene flow is migration, but migration in such a way that loss or gain of individuals is permanent, okay? So it's sort of permanent migration in or out of the population. So it could be immigration is when new organisms come into a population. Emigration is when organisms leave a population. But automatically, when an organism comes in or leaves a population, the P's and Q's of that population, the frequency of any allele, shifts in that gene. That automatically makes microevolution occur. However, these migrating animals need to have basically what's considered a permanent migration. When one organism leaves, it doesn't come back. If your two populations are constantly intermixing and interbreeding and moving around, it can't cause evolution in this case because there's too much genetic frequency or genetic mixing. So constant flow, so constant gene flow, will actually lead to reduced evolution, okay? At least reduced evolution between two groups. But stable migration, when one organism leaves and goes to another, that will lead to changes. So I'll kind of do a quick sketch of that. So let's say we have these two populations, okay? If this individual leaves and goes to the other side, that's going to completely change the gene frequency on both ends, okay? So now population 2 has a really high dominance of the blue trait, while population 1 has actually equal representation of the purple and blue trait for this given gene. However, that's permanent gene flow that will lead to evolution in the population. However, if that flow is constant, where that purple guy goes back, or a different purple guy goes back to the other population, then there's no evolution because it just kind of rewinds itself. However, you got to remember that the populations currently found on different areas or the population, at least for humans, found in different areas of the world, were established in times where migration was really hard and kind of permanent, which is why a lot of cultures and a lot of countries have very unique or kind of more common features found in certain countries than other countries. However, nowadays, because gene flow is constantly happening, we're actually kind of, in a way, reducing the differences in our population, and ultimately kind of causing any shifts and changes to kind of rewind itself, and possibly leading to more blending of the alleles found in different human populations. And in a way, that's still evolution, right? Because as long as a population shifts to something different than what it was, then it is considered evolution, even in the micro. There's not a new species, but the alleles that are available in that area have shifted. Okay. Another example is non-random mating. So non-random mating basically means sexual selection, meaning that the organisms that are having sexy times are selecting their mate based on things other than whether or not they're the ones who survive the longest. Okay? So generally speaking, this tends to be when organisms end up favoring traits that don't have an advantage to survival, other than the fact that for whatever reason, they tend to prefer that, the males and females tend to prefer that trait. And this tends to lead to something called sexual dimorphism, which is scenarios where the males and females in a population end up looking really different. And that's generally speaking because the rituals for allowing a male, generally speaking a male, to have a higher advantage of having a kid is so extreme that the whole population tends to drive the males to looking weirder and weirder and weirder, or having weirder and weirder traits over time, so that they're better able to attract the ladies. Okay? Generally speaking, it's the males that have to be more feathery, more crowned, more fluffy, because females need to invest more energy into making their babies versus males, that it's the males that need to put in the effort to have the female go, all right, I'll let you help fertilize my babies. Okay? So sometimes a fancy term for this is intersexual selection, which means interaction between those that are mating to have the babies. So if you're curious, on the slides are videos of weird rituals and cases of sexual selection. This one is weird dancing. That's kind of awkward, between what's called blue-footed boobies to attract each other for babies. And in this case, this isn't sexual dimorphism, so there's not extreme between the males and females, but they're still crafting these intricate rituals to attract each other. And sometimes you get what's called intra-selection for sexual selection, where instead of the male and females interacting with each other, the males or the females start to fight within their sex for the best chance of having babies. So in this case, generally speaking, competition for your mate. You're going to see this when males in the same species in the population start to fight each other or doing weird things to each other to get the females to let them be the father of the babies. So in this case, if you're curious, there is kangaroo fighting on the videos in the slides. The last scenario we're going to go over is genetic drift. So genetic drift occurs, generally speaking, in very small populations. So it's the fact that you have a very small population, chance, luck, probability, not natural selection, is going to cause certain traits to overrepresent themselves in a population, because the small population just happened to have one or two individuals with that weird trait that could either be not advantageous or neutral even. But instead, because that there is such a big proportion of the original population that then grew, they end up getting overrepresented. So there's two ways you can have a very small population occur. One is the founder effect. So like the founding fathers, a small group of individuals in a population leave and start a new population elsewhere. And any trait within that small population that may not even be represented that frequently in the original big group are going to overrepresent themselves in the new group. And also what's known as bottleneck. So in bottleneck, in this situation, you have a very large population. Then, for whatever reason, most of the population dies off, and you start again with a very small population. And any traits within that small population that may not even be an advantage end up being overrepresented in the group that ends up repopulating and growing out from the original population. Okay? So a famous example of genetic drift is what's known as Tay-Sachs disease. So Tay-Sachs disease are actually very frequently found in the U.S. in people who have Ashkenazi Jewish descent and people of Cajun descent, because the founding population for those ethnic groups happen to have one or two individuals with the Tay-Sachs allele. And because the populations were quite small when they started, that trait overrepresented itself in the population that is now currently in the US. Okay? So in this disease, there is an issue where basically because your lysosomes are not working the way they should, you get fat to basically build up in your brain. And eventually, children that have two Tay-Sachs alleles, so they're homozygous recessive, end up dying at a very young age. So this is why people who are of this descent often are recommended to do a genetic test if they are going to have a kid, just to check how many copies of the allele they may have in case they pass it on to their child. Another classic example of the founder effect is in the Amish community. So in the Amish community, there's actually a higher prevalence of 6 fingers and 6 toes, people with more than 5 fingers and toes, because the original founding population in the Amish community happened to have one person with an allele, and it's a dominant allele, so it's really represented because you only need one copy to show that, to have that trait. But the original founding population happened to have one individual that had that allele. So as a result, all their descendants in this fairly small community ended up having the allele. And now it's overrepresented in the Amish population, even though the country they originally came from had a very low frequency for this characteristics. But because the new group that established itself in America happened to have one of the people in the small group have the allele, now it's way more represented in the U.S. Amish population than the country they came from. So that would be an example of what we call the founder effect. Now not the opposite, a similar scenario that results from a very small population, but this one is more tragic, is called the bottleneck effect. So bottleneck effect is when a very large population suddenly dies off and there's only a few survivors. And any traits in the survivors, even ones that may not have allowed them to survive, are now going to be, that just happen to be neutral or even negative. Those traits are now going to be overrepresented in the new population just because there were so few members that happened to survive. So in this case, as you can see, the red individuals in the bottle aren't represented in the surviving population, and maybe that trait that's red isn't a disadvantage. They just happen to be, all the individuals that were red just happen to be wrong place, wrong time, just happen to be sitting next to the volcano at the wrong time. So as a result, in the new survival group, that one trait that wasn't necessarily a disadvantage is now gone. And all the survivors have way less diversity. Okay? And generally speaking, all genetic drift really leads to a reduction in variation. So you might want to write that down. All genetic drift leads to a loss of variation. Okay? This is different than gene flow because gene flow, depending on the scenario, can have a gain of variation or a loss of variation. Because with gene flow, if individuals come into the population, they're going to gain variation. But if individuals leave the population, they're going to lose variation. So variation in gene flow can depend on the scenario. But with genetic drift, because you're always starting with a smaller population than the original group, whether it's that smallest population breaking off or that smaller population just happening to survive, you're losing the majority of the group and the potential variation they may have brought into the group. Okay? So, classic examples of genetic drift through bottleneck is cheetahs. So cheetahs actually end up having a very low variation in their gene pool because there were at least 2 bottleneck defects, one at 10,000 years ago and one 100 years ago, that resulted in a huge loss in the majority of the population. And as a result, a huge loss in a lot of the variation and possible allele copies that they could have had. So now the current population of cheetahs are very similar, that all cheetahs are, well, it's not quite identical twins, but they're all basically siblings in terms of how diverse their gene pool is, because the genetics between 2 cheetahs are about as diverse as your genetics between you and your sibling. Okay? So in this case, you get that very low diversity, and now because there's less variation, there's less options to have in case there's a natural selection scenario that will kill off the majority of the population. Because there's very little variation, the majority of the population is much less capable of surviving. So this is an issue with conservation, because the more bottleneck there is, the less variation and the less ability your population has to adapting to extreme scenarios. And that means because they lack traits that may survive, and that means that this population now has a much higher chance of going extinct. So bottlenecks drastically reduce diversity, and make organisms at risk for extinction. At that point, we're done with the notes, move on to the rest of the lesson.